The photographs tell the story before any words are spoken. King, sort of. Charles III, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, stands alone on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. Below, the streets that once cheered his mother's jubilee now echo with different chants. Prince William paces in another room, his jaw set in. That familiar Windsor way, checking his phone for the latest headlines that seem to grow more brutal by the hour. Britain is angry, not the polite. The tutting kind of anger that simmers over tea and biscuits, but the raw, unforgiving fury of a nation that feels betrayed by the very institution it once held sacred. The question isn't whether the royal family is in crisis. It's whether they can survive what? Many are calling the most dangerous period for the monarchy since the English Civil War. But what really happened behind those palace walls? Why has a country that mourned Queen Elizabeth II with genuine grief now turned its collective back on her son and grandson? The answer lies not in scandal sheets or social media storms, but in a series of decisions, miscalculations, and tragic misunderstandings that transformed beloved princes into public enemies. This is the untold story of how King Charles III and Prince William went from being the future of the British monarchy to its most controversial figures. It's a story of impossible choices, family loyalty, and the crushing weight of a crown that no longer fits the head that wears it. The truth, as always with the Windsors, is far more complex than the headlines suggest. The morning King Charles III learned that his own people wanted him gone began like any other. Earl Grey tea at precisely 7:30 a.m. served in the same spode china his mother had preferred. The Times folded to the crossword, as was tradition. But tradition, Charles would discover that day, had become his enemy. Private Secretary Sir Clive Alderton entered the breakfast room at Windsor Castle with the expression of a man delivering news of a death in the family. In his hands, he carried not just the morning papers but polling data that would shake the very foundations of the House of Windsor. "Your Majesty," Alderton began, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years in royal service, "we need to discuss the numbers." The numbers. And Charles had been dreading them since the disastrous interview 3 weeks earlier, the one his communications team had assured him would humanize the monarchy. Instead, it had achieved something no Republican movement in Britain had managed in centuries. It had made the crown look expendable. 67% of British adults now believed the monarchy should be abolished within their lifetime. More damaging still, 73%, namely blamed King Charles and Prince William for what tabloids were calling the Great Royal Disaster. These weren't fringe protesters or university radicals. These were ordinary Britons, teachers, shop owners, nurses, the very people who had lined the streets for his mother's funeral just 18 months earlier. How had it come to this? Plus, the seeds of the crisis had been planted long before Charles ever wore the crown. They began with a phone call on a rainy Tuesday in October 2023, 3 weeks after his coronation. Diana's brother, Earl Spencer, had requested a private meeting. Not unusual in itself, except for the timing and the tone of his secretary's voice. There was urgency there, and something else Charles couldn't quite identify. Spencer arrived at Clarence House at tea time, declining refreshments with the brisk efficiency of a man who had come to deliver unpalatable truths. That he was thinner than Charles remembered, his famous Spencer hair now silver at the temples, but his blue eyes, Diana's eyes, were as sharp as ever. "Charles," Spencer began, using the familiar name that few dared employ with the new king, "we need to talk about the promises." The promises. Charles felt his stomach tighten. He knew exactly what Spencer meant, but he had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that this conversation would never come. In the weeks before Diana's death in 1997, during one of their last cordial exchanges, Charles had made certain assurances to his former wife, promises about their sons, about how they'd be raised, about the kind of monarchy they'd inherit. Most importantly, he had promised that Prince Harry would always have a place at the heart of the royal family, that the institution would evolve to embrace both brothers equally. "You remember what you told her," Spencer continued, not his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made his eulogy at Westminster Abbey so powerful. Sort of about Harry, about making sure he was never the spare. Charles did remember. To be fair, conversation had taken place at Kensington Palace, just weeks before that fateful trip to Paris. Diana had been concerned about Harry's future, about the psychological damage of growing up in William's shadow. Charles, perhaps motivated by guilt over their failed marriage, or perhaps by genuine paternal love, had made promises he now realized he could never keep. "The monarchy has evolved," Charles said carefully. "Harry, for what it's worth, has chosen his own path." Spencer's laugh was sharp, bitter. "Charles, you know as well as I do that Harry didn't choose anything. He was pushed out, by you and by William, by a system that couldn't adapt when it needed to most." The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke from an extinguished candle. Charles wanted to actually defend himself, to explain the impossible pressures, the competing demands, the way every decision seemed to damage someone. Honestly, but Spencer wasn't finished. Plus, Diana's sons were supposed to be different, Spencer continued. They were going to modernize the monarchy, bring it into the 21st century. Instead, you've managed to create a rift that makes your generation's scandals look like mild disagreements. What? Lee Spencer didn't know, what almost no one knew, was how close Charles had come to abdicating before his coronation. The decision had tormented him through the winter of 2022, as his mother lay dying and the full weight of succession became clear. In private conversations with his closest advisors, Charles had expressed doubts not just about his own readiness, about whether the institution itself could survive in its current form. The problem wasn't just Harry's departure, though that had certainly damaged the family's public image. The real crisis was structural, generational, and possibly insurmountable. The British people, particularly younger generations, saw the monarchy as an expensive anachronism. They tolerated, to be fair, it for Queen Elizabeth because of her personal dignity and historic service. But Charles carried baggage that no amount of constitutional duty could overcome. His relationship with pretty much Camilla, now accepted but never truly forgiven by large segments of the public. His decades of controversial opinions on everything from architecture to alternative medicine. His honestly reputation for micromanagement and petulance. Most damaging, to be fair of all, his perceived role in the breakdown of his son's relationship. Prince William understood the gravity of the situation better than most realized. While public sympathy for his personal loss, his mother, his fractured relationship with Harry, ran deep, he also recognized that sympathy was not the same as support for the institution. In private meetings with his father, William had become increasingly vocal about the need for dramatic reform. "We're not just actually fighting for our reputations," William had told Charles during a tense dinner at Sandringham in November 2023. "We're fighting for the monarchy's survival. And right now, we're losing." Catherine, and normally diplomatic to a fault, had been unusually direct. "The children ask me why people are so angry with their grandfather. What am I supposed to tell them? Plus that their great-grandmother's death released the British people from an obligation they never really wanted?" The conversation had ended badly, with Charles storming from the room and William left, staring at his untouched roast beef, wondering if his father truly understood how precarious their position had become. But the real turning point hadn't come from family arguments or private tensions. It had come from an unexpected source, a Freedom of Information request filed by a persistent journalist named Sarah Mitchell. Mitchell had spent 18 months investigating royal finances, specifically the Duchy of Cornwall's property dealings during the transition from Prince Charles to Prince William. What she uncovered wasn't illegal, but it was politically toxic in an era of housing crisis and economic hardship. The duchy, it emerged, had been systematically raising rents on properties housing military veterans while simultaneously claiming tax exemptions meant to support charitable causes. Worse still, several properties had been sold to overseas investors at below-market rates, apparently as personal favors to individuals with connections to both Charles and William. The story might have been buried in the financial pages of specialized publications, but Mitchell had something most royal correspondents lacked: a talent for making complex financial arrangements comprehensible to ordinary readers. Her series of articles, published across 3 weeks in February 2024, painted a devastating picture of royal privilege operating at the expense of the people they were supposed to serve. "The House of Windsor," Mitchell wrote in her final piece, "and has become a property empire that happens to wear crowns rather than a monarchy that happens to own land." The public reaction was swift and brutal. Veterans organizations, to be honest, called for investigations. Housing charities demanded explanations. Most damaging of all, ordinary Britons began asking uncomfortable questions about the basic fairness of hereditary wealth in a democratic society. Charles and William's response to the crisis would prove to be their greatest miscalculation. Rather than acknowledging the problems and promising reform, they retreated behind constitutional protocols and palace lawyers. Their official statement, actually, drafted by teams of legal and communications experts, was technically accurate but emotionally tone-deaf. "The Duchy of Cornwall operates within all legal requirements and contributes a lot to the British economy," the statement read. His Her Majesty and the Prince of Wales remain committed to their constitutional duties and the service of the British people. What the public heard was, "We've done nothing wrong, and we're not going to change." The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Social media campaigns began calling for royal properties to be transferred to public ownership. Protest marches, initially small and poorly organized, began attracting thousands of participants. Most ominously for, I guess, the royal family, polls began showing that republicanism was no longer a fringe position. The crisis deepened when Prince Harry, speaking from his California home, gave an impromptu interview to an American journalist. He wasn't supposed to comment on British royal affairs. The Sussexes had agreed to maintain silence on family matters as part of their exit arrangement. But the duchy revelations had apparently pushed him past his breaking point. "My father and I think—" "Brother liked to talk about service," Harry said, his voice heavy with disappointment rather than anger. "But service to whom? Service to an institution that enriches itself while veterans sleep rough on the streets of London? That's not the monarchy my mother believed in. That's not the monarchy William and I were raised to inherit." Funny enough, the interview lasted less than 10 minutes, and Harry had clearly not planned to say as much as he did. By the end, he looked exhausted. Yeah, like a man who had finally spoken truths he had been carrying for too long. But the damage was done. Harry's words, coming from someone with intimate knowledge of royal operations, gave credibility to the critics' arguments. More importantly, they provided emotional context that transformed a story about property transactions into a narrative about broken promises and betrayed trust. Charles watched the interview alone in his private study at Highgrove, on the Gloucestershire estate that had been his refuge for decades. The room was filled with watercolors he had painted, books on organic farming, architecture, the accumulated evidence of a lifetime spent trying to make a difference in ways that mattered to him. Now, those very interests, dismissed by critics as eccentric hobbies of a privileged dilettante, seemed to symbolize everything the public found objectionable about the modern monarchy. He thought about calling William. But what was there to say? They had both, known this day might come. They had both hoped it wouldn't happen so soon or so completely. The next morning brought news that would transform a royal crisis into a constitutional emergency. The Labour Party, sensing political opportunity in the monarchy's weakness, announced that they'd include Republican reform in their next election manifesto. Not immediately, they were careful to clarify, but within a generation, for the British people deserve a democratic choice about their future, Labour leader Keir Starmer announced at a press conference in Westminster. The monarchy has served this country well for many centuries, but service should be earned, not inherited. Even more shocking was the response from within Charles's own government. Several conservative MPs, normally reliable defenders of royal prerogatives, refused to condemn Labour's position. Behind closed doors, senior Tories were reportedly telling colleagues that the monarchy had become an electoral liability. For Prince William, I guess, watching these developments from Adelaide Cottage in Windsor, the situation felt like watching a slow-motion car crash. Everything he had been trained for, everything he had sacrificed for, was crumbling in real time. The life of service he had accepted as his destiny was being rejected by the very people he was meant to serve. And Catherine found him in their kitchen at dawn, staring at his phone with the hollow expression of someone processing devastating news. The children were still asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware that their grandfather's reign might be measured in months rather than decades. "What are you going to do?" Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer. William had been preparing for this moment, consciously or not, for years. "I'm going to try to save it," William replied, on his voice carrying the weight of inevitability, "even if it costs us everything." But as the sun rose over Windsor Castle that morning, illuminating the ancient stones that had housed British monarchs for nearly 1,000 years, one question remained unanswered. Was the institution still worth saving? The phone call that would change everything came at 6:47 a.m. on March 15th, 2024. Charles was in the middle of his morning routine, 20 minutes on the exercise bike, and followed by a shower and the first cup of tea, when his private secretary knocked on the bedroom door with unprecedented urgency. "Sir, I apologize for the intrusion, but we've a situation. One more thing." The situation was a front-page story in The Guardian that would be picked up by every major news outlet within hours. An unnamed palace, basically. An insider, someone with detailed knowledge of royal family dynamics, had provided a devastating account of how Charles and William had handled the Harry crisis. According to the source, Charles had ordered palace staff to monitor Harry's communications and financial arrangements even after his departure to America. More damaging still, the story claimed that William had actively worked to exclude Harry from family events, including their grandfather Prince Philip's funeral planning, despite Philip's own wishes for both grandsons to be involved. The revelations painted a picture of a family torn apart not by external pressures or media manipulation, but by petty jealousies and power struggles that had spiraled out of control. Most damaging of all was the suggestion that Charles had used his new position as king to settle old scores, prioritizing family grievances over national unity. Yet the palace's initial response was predictably defensive. A terse statement denied any improper surveillance and insisted that all family decisions had been made in accordance with long-established protocols. But the damage was already done. The story had provided a narrative framework that made sense of years of confusing royal drama. This wasn't about duty or tradition or constitutional principle. And this was about two men who had allowed personal resentments to override their public responsibilities. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Within hours of the story breaking, protesters had gathered outside Buckingham Palace, carrying signs reading "Family First" and "End the Windsor War." More organized demonstrations followed in Manchester, Birmingham, and Edinburgh. For the first time in living memory, and the crowds gathering outside royal residences were hostile rather than celebratory. But the real measure of how much had changed came from an unexpected source: the Queen's former lady-in-waiting, Lady Susan Hussey, who broke decades of silence to give an interview to the BBC. Lady Hussey had, to be fair, served the royal family for over 60 years. She had been present at some of the most private and difficult moments in royal history. Her discretion was, legendary, and her loyalty unquestioned. When she spoke, people listened. "Her late Majesty would be heartbroken," Lady Hussey said, her voice trembling with emotion that seemed genuine rather than theatrical. "She, in my opinion, spent her entire reign trying to keep the family together, to show that personal sacrifice was the price of public service, to see her life's work undone by petty squabbles and wounded pride. It's a tragedy beyond words. Not gonna lie." The interview was devastating precisely because it came from someone who couldn't be dismissed as a Republican agitator or media troublemaker. Lady Hussey had given her life to the monarchy. If she was speaking out, it meant the situation was beyond repair through normal channels. Charles watched like the interview from his private sitting room at Clarence House, surrounded by photographs of his mother that suddenly seemed like accusations rather than comfort. Did Elizabeth II gazed out from dozens of frames, as a young princess, as a new queen, as an elderly monarch surrounded by her family, and in every image she seemed to be asking the same question: how could you let this happen? The weight of that unspoken reproach was crushing. Charles had spent 70 years preparing to be king, and now, 18 months into his reign, he was presiding over the monarchy's potential destruction. Everything his mother had built, everything she had sacrificed for, was crumbling on his watch. The crisis reached a new low when Prince George, Charles's own grandson and second in line to the throne, became inadvertently involved in the story. The 12-year-old had been overheard at school asking a friend whether his grandfather was a bad person because of what he had seen on television. The incident, reported by a parent who apparently thought it was amusing rather than tragic, became symbolic of the monarchy's broader problem. If the future king's own grandson was questioning his grandfather's character, what hope was there for public support? William's response to his son's innocent question revealed the depth of his own struggle with the situation. According to sources close to the family, he had sat George down for a conversation about duty, service, and the difference between private people and public figures. But the 12-year-old's follow-up question had been devastating in its simplicity. "But, Dad, if Grandpa is hurting Uncle Harry, why don't you stop him?" How do you explain to a child that stopping family dysfunction might require destroying the institution he's destined to inherit? How do, honestly, you teach duty and service when the system itself seems designed to reward the worst human impulses? These were the questions keeping William awake at night as the crisis entered its 4th month. Catherine, normally his steadiest advisor, seemed as lost as he was. And they had built their entire adult lives around the assumption that they were preparing for a big role that would matter, that would make a difference. Now they were watching that role being redefined as an expensive irrelevance maintained at public expense. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine royal engagement. Charles was opening a new hospital wing in Liverpool, the kind of ceremonial duty that had been performed by British monarchs for generations. But instead of polite applause and carefully orchestrated photo opportunities, he was met by organized protests and hostile crowds. "Tax the royals," chanted one group. "Democracy now," shouted another. Most personally wounding of all was a banner held by a group of military veterans. "Service means sacrifice, not luxury." Charles had been through hostile crowds before, during the worst days of the Diana years, during the early period of his relationship with Camilla. But this felt different. Yet this wasn't about his personal failings or private life. This was a rejection of everything he represented, everything he had been taught to value. The moment that would be replayed endlessly on social media came when a young nurse approached him during the hospital tour. She was polite, respectful, professional, everything a royal interaction was supposed to be, but her question cut through decades of protocol like a surgical blade. "Your Majesty," she said, "with respect, and how do you justify spending millions on coronation ceremonies when we can't afford proper staffing levels?" Charles had been briefed on the hospital's challenges. He knew about the budget cuts, the staff shortages, the impossible demands placed on healthcare workers. He also knew that his coronation had cost the public purse over £40 million. The question was fair, reasonable, and completely unanswerable within the framework of royal propriety. "The coronation is, to be honest, a constitutional necessity," Charles replied, falling back on the safe language his advisors had prepared for such moments. "It represents continuity and stability that benefit all aspects of British society." But even as he spoke the words, Charles could see in the nurse's eyes that she wasn't convinced. More importantly, he wasn't convinced. The coronation had been a magnificent spectacle, but what had it actually accomplished? What problems had it solved? What lives had pretty much, and it improved, and the video clip of the exchange went viral within hours. Not because Charles had said anything particularly offensive, but because his response had seemed so hollow, so disconnected from the reality of people's daily struggles. Here was a man who had just spent more on a single ceremony than most people would see in a lifetime, explaining why that expense was necessary to a woman who couldn't get adequate resources to do her job. The optics were disastrous. But the deeper problem was that Charles himself had begun to doubt his own talking points. The monarchy's traditional justifications, stability, continuity, service, sounded increasingly empty when measured against the practical needs of a modern democracy struggling with genuine challenges. That night, alone in his study at Highgrove, Charles did something he had never done before. He seriously considered abdication, not as a dramatic gesture or emotional response, but as a rational decision based on evidence. The monarchy was becoming a liability to the country he was supposed to serve. His continued presence as king was making it harder, not easier, for Britain to address its real problems. He thought about his mother, who had faced calls for abdication during the worst moments of the 1990s, had weathered the storms through pure determination and an unshakable sense of duty. But Elizabeth II had possessed something Charles increasingly realized he lacked: the unquestioning support of her heir apparent. During the Diana crisis, during the Annus Horribilis, during every major royal scandal of the late 20th century, Prince Charles had stood beside his mother. His support might have been grudging at times, privately critical in others, but publicly he had been loyal. The institution had survived because the succession was secure, because the future king understood that defending the monarchy meant defending each other. Now Charles found himself without that crucial support. William hadn't openly criticized his father, but his silence spoke volumes. In private conversations, palace staff reported, so the Prince of Wales had begun referring to the current crisis as Dad's mess, and making pointed comments about the need for different leadership. The generational divide within the royal family had become a chasm that threatened to swallow the entire institution. Charles represented the old model of monarchy, dutiful, traditional, somewhat removed from popular opinion. William embodied something newer, more accessible, more media-savvy, more attuned to public sentiment. Under normal circumstances, this transition from father to son would happen gradually, over decades. But these, weren't normal circumstances, which the monarchy was facing an existential crisis that demanded immediate and decisive action. Every day Charles remained on the throne was another day of declining poll numbers, growing protests, and increasing calls for Republican reform. Every day William waited to act was another day the institution grew weaker. And the conversation they both knew was coming finally happened on a cold March evening at Windsor Castle. Charles had invited William and Catherine for dinner, ostensibly to discuss Easter arrangements for the children. But both men knew the real purpose of the meeting. They talked around the subject for most of the meal, discussing George's school performance and Charlotte's piano lessons, the kind of normal family conversation that felt increasingly precious as their public roles consumed their private lives. But over Brandy and Charles's private study, the pretense finally fell away. "You know what needs to happen," William said quietly, his voice carrying none of the deference protocol demanded. "The question is whether you're going to make the choice, or let circumstances make it for you." Charles looked at his son, this man he had raised, guided, and prepared for kingship, and saw not rebellion, but resignation. William wasn't plotting against him or maneuvering for advantage. He was simply stating what they both knew to be true. The current situation was unsustainable. "Your mother would never have abdicated," Charles said, though he wasn't sure if he was making an argument or an observation. "Mother never had to," William replied. "She never lost the people's trust the way we've. She never had to choose between family loyalty and national service." The words hung between them, laden with implications neither man wanted to fully acknowledge. William was essentially saying that Charles had failed where Elizabeth had succeeded, that the crisis engulfing the monarchy wasn't just bad luck or media manipulation, but the result of choices Charles had made and continued to make. But William was also acknowledging something else, that saving the monarchy might require sacrificing the monarchs, that the institution was more important than the individuals who embodied it. That duty ultimately meant accepting responsibility for failures as well as successes. Charles stared into his brandy glass, seeing his own reflection distorted in the amber liquid. He thought about the promises he had made to Diana, the commitments he had given to his mother, and the oaths he had sworn at his coronation. All of them seemed to be pulling him in different directions, demanding sacrifices that couldn't all be made simultaneously. "What about look, Harry?" Charles asked suddenly. "If I step aside, if you take over, what happens to him?" The question surprised them both. In all their discussions about the monarchy's future, they had danced around the Harry issue without directly addressing it. But now, and faced with the possibility of fundamental change, Charles found himself returning to the original sin that had started this entire crisis. William was quiet for a long time before answering. "I don't know," he said finally. "I honestly don't know if the damage can be repaired. But I know it can't get worse than it already is." It was, Charles realized, probably the most honest thing anyone had said to him in months. The palace was full of people paid to tell him what he wanted to hear, as to find solutions that didn't require difficult choices. But his son was offering him something more valuable, the truth, however painful it might be. The meeting ended without any firm decisions, but both men knew that a threshold had been crossed. The conversation that had been unthinkable 6 months earlier was now inevitable. The only questions were timing, method, and whether they could find a way to save the institution they both loved, even if it cost them everything they had been born to inherit. As William and Catherine drove home through the Windsor night, past the ancient stones that had housed British monarchs for nearly a millennium, they both understood that they were living through history. The decisions made in the coming weeks would determine not just their own futures, but the future of the British monarchy itself. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. But for the first time in months, that William felt something approaching hope. Change, however painful, was finally possible. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered not through official channels but by private courier to William's Adelaide cottage home. The envelope bore no royal seal, no official markings, just his name written in his father's distinctive handwriting. Inside, 3 pages pretty much. That would change the course of British history. Catherine found William in their kitchen 2 hours later. Still holding the letter, his untouched coffee growing cold beside him. She had seen him process difficult news before: his grandfather's death, Harry's departure, the endless stream of royal crises. But this was different. He looked like a man who had just learned his own execution date. "He's going to do it," William said without looking up. "Dad's going to abdicate." The words that had been whispered in palace corridors for months were now written in Charles's own hand. Not immediately. Yeah, the letter explained, but after the summer, following the traditional royal calendar of engagements. A dignified withdrawal, he called it, designed to give the institution its best chance at survival. But Charles's letter contained more than just a resignation announcement. It was also a confession, an apology, and a desperate attempt to repair damage that might already be irreversible. He acknowledged his failures with Harry, his miscalculations during the duchy crisis, his inability to connect with a public that had evolved beyond his understanding. Most importantly, he was offering William something unprecedented in royal history, the chance to rebuild the monarchy from scratch. "I won't burden you with my mistakes," Charles had written in his careful script. "The crown you sort of inherit will be yours to reshape, free from the constraints of my reign and my reputation. Make it worthy of your children and of the people we serve." William set the letter down and looked at his wife, seeing his own complex emotions reflected in her eyes. Relief that actually the crisis might finally end, which terror at the responsibility being thrust upon them. Grief for the family relationships that had been sacrificed along the way. "What are you going to tell the children?" Catherine asked. It was a practical question with no good answer. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that his grandfather is giving up the most important job in the country because he wasn't very good at it? How do you prepare him for the reality that his own path to kingship has just been accelerated by decades? But before I think, William could answer, their conversation was interrupted by George himself, appearing in the kitchen doorway. With the sort of casual curiosity of a child who has learned that adult conversations often contain interesting secrets. "Dad, why are there so many cars outside? And why does Mum look like she's been crying?" The cars were media vans, arriving faster than palace security could manage them. Word of Charles's decision had leaked, not the details, not the timeline, but enough to create a feeding frenzy. Within hours, basically, a major news organization in the world would have crews stationed outside royal residences, waiting for confirmation of the story that would define the 21st century's relationship with monarchy. William knelt to his son's level, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that this conversation would be remembered forever. "George, sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions about their jobs," he said. "Grandpa has been doing his job for a very long time, and he's decided it might be time for someone younger to take over." "You mean Dad's job?" George asked, with the casual directness that made adult euphemisms impossible. "Maybe, son. We're still talking about it." But as William spoke those words, he realized they weren't entirely true. Charles's letter had made the decision inevitable. The monarchy couldn't survive another 6 months of crisis, let alone years of gradual transition. If Charles was stepping down, William would have to step up immediately, completely, and publicly. The next few days passed in a blur of emergency meetings, legal consultations, and carefully worded statements that said nothing while confirming everything. Palace officials found themselves preparing for something that had no modern precedent: a voluntary abdication by a British monarch in favor of constitutional, rather than personal reasons. The last time a British king had abdicated, Edward VIII had done so for love, a choosing marriage to Wallis Simpson over duty to the crown. But Charles's abdication was different. He was stepping down not to pursue personal happiness, but to save an institution he believed was more important than any individual, including himself. The constitutional mechanics of abdication were surprisingly complex. Parliament would need, in my opinion, to pass legislation. Plus, I think the Commonwealth realms would need to consent. Legal experts would need to untangle centuries of precedent to create a framework for voluntary succession. But the political mechanics were even more complicated. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak found himself in the unprecedented position of managing a transition that could either stabilize British democracy or trigger its fundamental restructuring. The Labour Party, sensing opportunity, continued to push for a referendum on the monarchy's future. Republican groups, emboldened by the crisis, organized mass demonstrations in major cities. Most dangerously of all, the crisis had exposed deep fractures within British society that extended far beyond questions of royal succession. The anti-monarchy movement had attracted support from groups with broader grievances: young people frustrated by economic inequality, immigrants who saw the royal family as symbols of historical oppression, working-class communities who viewed hereditary privilege as fundamentally unjust. William, for what it's worth, understood that he wasn't just inheriting a crown, he was inheriting a country on the edge of social upheaval. The monarchy's survival would depend not just on his personal performance, but on his ability to address underlying tensions that had been building for decades. His first major decision as heir apparent was also his most controversial. He wanted to recall Prince Harry for the transition period. The idea came to him during a sleepless night at Adelaide Cottage as he wrestled with the enormity of what lay ahead. William had always performed better with Harry beside him. Their joint appearances had been magical in ways that their individual engagements rarely achieved. More importantly, bringing Harry home might signal that the new reign would prioritize family unity over institutional pride. But when William floated the idea during a family meeting at Windsor Castle, the reaction was swift and negative. "Absolutely not," said Princess Anne, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades managing royal crises. "Harry forfeited his right to be part of these decisions when he chose celebrity over duty." Prince Edward, normally diplomatic to a fault, was equally direct. "William, I understand the impulse, but you can't rebuild the monarchy's credibility by rewarding disloyalty." Even Catherine, usually supportive of William's instincts about family matters, expressed reservations. "I love Harry," she said carefully, "but bringing him back now might look like panic rather than strength." Only one voice supported William's proposal, and it came from an unexpected source: King Charles himself. "The boy should come home," Charles said quietly during a private conversation with his son. "Not permanently, perhaps, but for this transition. The people need to see that we're a family first, an institution second." Charles's support for Harry's return was deeply personal as well as political. The guilt pretty much over his younger son's departure had haunted him throughout his brief reign. If abdication could create space for reconciliation, then perhaps something positive could emerge from the wreckage of his kingship. But William's basically desire to bring Harry home ran into an insurmountable obstacle. Harry himself didn't want to come. And the phone call between the brothers lasted 47 minutes and was, by all accounts, devastating for both men. Harry listened to William's proposal with what sounded like genuine consideration, but his eventual refusal was absolute. "I can't, Will," Harry said, his voice thick with emotion that carried clearly across the Atlantic. "I've built, I think, a life here, Megan's built a life here. We're basically finally happy, finally free from all the drama and dysfunction. I can't put my family through that again." "This is your family, too," William replied, though he knew even as he said it that the argument was weak. "No," Harry said firmly. "You're my family. Dad's my family. But the institution? Well, the palace, the endless briefings and counter-briefings and media wars? Like, that's not family. That's, look, the thing that destroys families." The conversation ended with both brothers in tears, mourning not just their current estrangement, but the futures they had once imagined sharing. For William, Harry's refusal meant facing the most challenging period of his life without the person who had always been his closest ally. For Harry, it meant accepting that his break with Royal life was permanent and irreversible. As news of Charles's impending abdication became official, the public reaction revealed just how fractured British opinion had become. And traditionalists mourned the loss of stability and continuity. Reformists celebrated the possibility of change. Republicans saw, an opportunity to finally end the monarchy altogether. But the most significant response came from an unexpected demographic. Young people who had previously shown little interest in royal affairs suddenly began paying attention. And William and Catherine represented something their generation could relate to, a young family trying to balance professional responsibilities with personal values, struggling to maintain authenticity within institutional constraints. The first, major test of William's leadership came sooner than anyone expected. 3 days after Charles's abdication announcement, a terrorist attack in Manchester claimed 14 lives and injured dozens more. The incident, it required an immediate royal response. But Charles was already withdrawing from public duties, leaving William to represent the crown during a national crisis. William's decision to travel to Manchester within hours of the attack, without the usual security protocols or media management, marked a clear break from traditional royal procedure. He spent the day visiting hospitals, meeting with families of victims, and walking through the attack site with none of the usual ceremonial distance that typically separated royalty from tragedy. The image that dominated news coverage showed William kneeling beside a 6-year-old girl who had been separated from her parents in the chaos following the attack. He wasn't delivering prepared remarks or following official protocol. He was simply being present with a frightened child, offering whatever comfort a stranger could provide. The public response was immediate and overwhelming, which social media filled with praise for William's authentic engagement with real human suffering. Editorial writers who had been calling for Republican reform suddenly began discussing the possibility of renewed monarchy under younger leadership. Most importantly, the Manchester response demonstrated something that constitutional experts had been debating for months. William possessed the instinctive understanding of public sentiment that had eluded both his father and grandfather during their most challenging moments. But William's success in Manchester also highlighted the impossible position he now occupied. Every effective action he took as heir apparent seemed to underscore Charles's failures as king. Every expression of public confidence in William's leadership was implicitly a criticism of his father's reign. The family dynamics became even more complicated when Charles, watching William's Manchester response from Highgrove, experienced what his staff described as a complete emotional breakdown. The man who had waited 70 years to be king was confronting the reality that he had been fundamentally unsuited for the role. And while his son seemed to grasp intuitively what had taken Charles decades to learn imperfectly. Palace staff reported that Charles spent 3 days in his private quarters, refusing visitors and canceling all engagements. When he finally emerged, he looked like a man who had aged years in the span of a week. But he also seemed to have found a kind of peace in accepting his limitations. "So I was trained for a role that no longer exists," Charles told his private secretary during their first meeting after his withdrawal. William is inventing a role that might actually matter. The formal abdication ceremony took place on a gray September morning at Windsor Castle, witnessed by senior members of the royal family, government officials, and representatives from the Commonwealth realms. Charles's abdication speech, delivered live on television, was brief, dignified, and heartbreaking in its honesty. "I have served this nation for 74 years, Charles said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. "I have tried to fulfill the duties of kingship with dignity and dedication. But I have also learned that good intentions aren't always enough, and that love of country sometimes requires the hardest sacrifice of all, stepping aside so that others can serve more effectively." The speech lasted 7 minutes and contained no criticism of his family, no justification for his failures, no attempt to secure his historical reputation. It was simply a man accepting responsibility for his shortcomings and prioritizing the institution over his personal pride. William's accession to the throne was immediate and constitutional, requiring no ceremony beyond his oath of allegiance to the crown. But the real test would come in the weeks and months that followed, as he attempted to rebuild public confidence in an institution that had seemed on the verge of collapse just months earlier. His first major decision as King William V was to announce a complete review of royal finances, led by an independent committee with full access to all royal accounts. The move was unprecedented in its transparency and designed to address the public concerns that had triggered the entire crisis. His second decision was even more significant. He invited representatives from Republican organizations to participate in discussions about the monarchy's future role. For the first time in British history, a sitting monarch was acknowledging that the continuation of hereditary monarchy was not inevitable, but dependent on public consent that had to be earned rather than inherited. And the most personal decision came last. William chose to break royal protocol and make a public statement about his relationship with Prince Harry. "My brother and I have different views about how to serve our country and our family," William said during his first televised address as king. "Those differences have caused pain for all of us, but they don't diminish my love for him or my respect for the choices he's made. The door to reconciliation remains open, not because he's my brother, but because forgiveness and understanding are essential to the values we claim to represent." What's interesting is the statement was carefully crafted to avoid seeming like manipulation or emotional blackmail, but its impact on both brothers was immediate. Harry, watching from California, reportedly broke down completely, overwhelmed by the public acknowledgement of their bond despite their differences. More importantly, William's words signaled a fundamental shift in how the royal family would handle internal conflicts. Instead of the traditional approach of private resolution and public silence, he was embracing a more transparent model that acknowledged human imperfection while maintaining institutional dignity. The public, to be fair, response to William's early decisions as king suggested that his gamble might be working. Polling data showed a gradual recovery in support for the monarchy, that particularly among younger demographics who had previously been the most critical. Republican organizations, while maintaining their long-term goals, acknowledged that William represented a different kind of monarch than the one they had been opposing. But the real measure of William's success would come from an unexpected source: the response of the international community to Britain's royal revolution. Other constitutional monarchies, particularly in Europe, had been watching the British crisis with deep concern. The failure of the world's oldest and most prestigious monarchy would have implications for royal institutions everywhere. But William's transparent approach to reform offered a potential model for modernizing hereditary leadership without abandoning it entirely. Crown Prince Frederick of Denmark was among the first to publicly praise William's courageous leadership during constitutional and transformation. Queen Maxima of the Netherlands noted the inspiring example of institutional evolution that Britain was demonstrating. Most significantly, Republican movements in other monarchical countries began acknowledging that William's reforms addressed many of their fundamental concerns about hereditary privilege. In my opinion, international validation was psychologically important for William, but the domestic challenges remained enormous, and the British people had not simply been dissatisfied with Charles personally, they had been questioning whether monarchy itself remained relevant to their lives and values. William's response was to fundamentally reimagine what royal service could look like in the 21st century. Instead of ceremonial duties and traditional patronages, he focused the monarchy's resources on addressing specific social problems: housing inequality, mental health support, environmental protection, and youth opportunity programs. The kind of changes weren't merely symbolic, and William personally reviewed every aspect of royal operations, eliminating expenditures that seemed excessive while redirecting resources toward tangible public benefit. The royal train was sold. Several royal residences were converted into public facilities. The actual number of full-time royal staff was reduced by 40%, with savings redirected to charitable initiatives. Most controversially, William announced that his children would attend state schools and that Prince George would be encouraged to pursue higher education and professional experience before assuming royal duties. The decision marked a complete break from centuries of royal tradition, but it also demonstrated William's commitment to ensuring that future monarchs understood the lives of ordinary citizens. The transformation was not without costs. Several, senior royal staff resigned, unwilling to work within the new framework. Some traditional supporters felt that William had gone too far in accommodating Republican sentiment. Conservative politicians worried, to be fair, that constitutional monarchy was being weakened beyond recognition. But 6 months after Charles's abdication, the evidence suggested that William's radical approach was succeeding where traditional methods had failed. Public approval for the monarchy reached its highest level in over a decade. Importantly, the institutional questions that had seemed so urgent during the crisis began to fade as people focused on the monarchy's practical contributions rather than its symbolic meaning. The moment that seemed to seal William's transformation of the royal role came during a visit to a food bank in Liverpool, the same city where Charles had faced hostile protests just months earlier. A volunteer, worker, unaware that she was speaking to the King of England, thanked him for his help sorting donations and mentioned how different things felt now that the royals actually seemed to care about people like us. William's response, that caring had always been the point, even when it hadn't been expressed effectively, captured something essential about his approach to leadership. He, wasn't claiming to be perfect or promising that the monarchy would never again face criticism, but he was demonstrating that hereditary institutions could evolve, that tradition could coexist with accountability, and that service could be genuine rather than performative. The final test of William's reign came at the 1-year anniversary of Charles's abdication. Republican groups had planned massive demonstrations to mark what they called the failure of hereditary leadership. But when the day arrived, the protests were smaller and less passionate than organizers had expected. The reason became clear during William's anniversary address to the nation. Instead of celebrating his own success or defending royal prerogatives, he used the opportunity to acknowledge the pain the crisis had caused and to commit to continued reform. A year ago, our country was asking fundamental questions about leadership, accountability, and service, William said. Those questions haven't disappeared, and they shouldn't. A monarchy, in my opinion, that fears scrutiny is a monarchy that has forgotten its purpose. We exist to serve, and service requires constant examination of whether we're fulfilling that, to be honest, mission effectively. The speech lasted 15 minutes and contained no grand promises or dramatic declarations. but it demonstrated something that had been missing from royal communication for decades: genuine humility combined with confident leadership. William was modeling how to accept responsibility for inherited problems while working constructively toward inherited solutions. Yet perhaps the most significant moment in the entire crisis came 3 months later, when Prince Harry made an unexpected trip to London for a private family meeting. The visit wasn't announced officially, and no public reconciliation took place. But staff reported that Harry spent 2 hours with his father and brother, and that all three men emerged from the meeting emotionally drained, but somehow lighter. Harry returned to California the next day, and his life in America continued unchanged. But the fact that the meeting had occurred at all, that the family had found a way to be together despite their differences, seemed to close the circle of pain that had begun the entire crisis. King William V's reign was still young, and the challenges facing the monarchy remained substantial. Republican sentiment hadn't disappeared, economic inequality continued to strain social cohesion, and the fundamental questions about hereditary leadership in democratic societies remained unresolved. But William had demonstrated something that had seemed impossible during the darkest days of the crisis: that the monarchy could change without destroying itself, that tradition could adapt without losing its meaning, and that leadership could be both humble and effective. The boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin, watched his parents' marriage collapse, and seen his brother choose exile over duty, had somehow found a way to transform personal tragedy into institutional renewal. And the sort of crown he wore was lighter than the one his father had abandoned, but it was also stronger, more flexible, and more firmly rooted in the consent of the people it claimed to serve. Whether that would be enough to ensure the monarchy's long-term survival remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, the question was no longer whether the institution could adapt to the modern world. William had proven that it could. And the remaining question was whether the modern world still needed what the monarchy, at its best, could offer: a symbol of continuity, a focus for national unity, and a reminder that service and sacrifice could still matter in an age that often seemed to value neither. The answer to that question would be written not in palace corridors or parliamentary debates, but in the daily choices of ordinary citizens who would decide whether King William had earned their trust, their respect, and ultimately, their support for an institution that had survived for over 1,000 years by learning, sometimes painfully, how to change.